As I was saying, my colleagues and I have been coming to the Senate floor talking about a very, very important issue for our country that we should be spending much more time focusing on, and that's the importance of growing our economy. Mr. President, with the exception of national defense, I believe there's no more important moral imperative for this body, for the federal government, to focus on this issue. And unfortunately, as we've seen, the administration doesn't focus on it. They don't want to talk about the importance of growing the economy because the record that they have of economic growth for Americans, particularly middle-class Americans, has been dismal. And I've been trying to get my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to focus on this chart over the last several weeks, but this chart says a lot. If you look at the different records of different administrations, Democrats, Republicans, the Obama years have been a lost decade of economic growth. Never hit, this red line here is 3% GDP growth. Decent, not great. You see Reagan, Clinton, Kennedy, Johnson, they've all way, way better numbers. Worst recovery in over 70 years. That's a fact. Now, they don't want to talk about it. We should talk about it a lot more. I clearly think it's one of the most important things we can be doing in this body. And one way to do that, Mr. President, to reignite the American dream, to reignite economic growth, especially for the next generation, like our pages here. One way we can do that is to reduce burdensome and unnecessary regulations, and everybody agrees with that. President, all my colleagues here, to reduce burdensome and unnecessary federal regulations and to build infrastructure for America. And Mr. President, that is exactly what my amendment number 3912 to the Transportation Appropriations Bill that's being so ably managed by my colleague from Maine and Rhode Island, that's what my amendment would do, Mr. President. I want to talk about that amendment for a little bit. My amendment would allow states and communities throughout this nation the ability to expedite permitting for the maintenance, reconstruction, or construction of structurally deficient bridges. Pretty simple. If you're going to do maintenance on a bridge, you're not going to expand the bridge. The amendment is very narrowly tailored. It says if you are going to do maintenance, construction, or reconstruction of a bridge that's structurally deficient, then the federal government won't be a burden. We will expedite the permitting by waiving many other permitting requirements. So that's it. Very simple. As a matter of fact, it's only 2 paragraphs, this amendment. And it's a win-win for the country. It will help boost our economy, get us back to economic growth by investing in infrastructure, and importantly, Mr. President, it will keep American families safe. So it's a common sense approach that I'm hoping my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will support. Now, recently, President Obama was asked about the economy, he was asked about our crumbling infrastructure, and he talked about the need for infrastructure investment, which I completely agree with. However, he laid the blame for a lack of investment in infrastructure on Republicans, who he said were unwilling to spend on our infrastructure. Well, I think with the highway bill, the WRDA bill, with this appropriations bill, we are doing that. And again, it's very bipartisan. So I don't think what the president is saying is true there. We're certainly willing to invest in infrastructure, which is so important for our economy, but we need to do it wisely. And we need to make sure that our taxpayer money does not go to unintended uses. In fact, I believe, as do many of my colleagues, that there is perhaps nothing more essential to growing our economy and competing globally than sound infrastructure for America. But throwing money at projects that aren't ready for development because of the burdensome permitting and regulatory requirements that we often see from the federal government is not a sound use of taxpayer dollars. A recent column in the Wall Street Journal points out that of the $800 billion of taxpayer money that was passed several years ago as part of the president's stimulus package, only $30 billion was spent on transportation infrastructure. That's remarkable. $800 billion, only $30 billion. Why? One of the big reasons why is because these infrastructure projects were not shovel-ready because of the onerous permitting requirements and environmental reviews. Consider this, Mr. President. The average time for an environmental review for a major transportation project in the United States has increased to a staggering 8 years. 8 years to get a transportation project approved in terms of federal permitting. 8 years in 2011, and that's up from 3.5 years in the year 2000. So we've more than doubled the time in less than 7 years because of federal permitting requirements. The average environmental impact statement was about 22 pages when NEPA, which requires EISs, which are important, 22 pages when that bill initially passed, the average EIS. Today's highway projects often have EISs that are well above 1,000 pages. And, Mr. President, it also takes on average over 5 years to permit a bridge in the United States. Nobody wants this. As a matter of fact, former President Bill Clinton highlighted the need for reform in this area in a well-known Newsweek article in 2011, where he was on the front cover, where he was talking about how to get Americans back to work. How do we get Americans back to work? In one of his top recommendations was to make sure that when we have infrastructure projects, the permitting requirements don't take forever. He said, quote, "We need to keep the full review process on permitting on infrastructure projects when there are real environmental concerns, absolutely. But when there aren't, the federal government should be able to give a waiver to the states to speed up times for construction projects." That's former President Bill Clinton's recommendation. Well, in effect, that's exactly what my amendment does. Again, if you're going to repair or build a bridge and keep it the same capacity, a 2-lane bridge stays a 2-lane bridge, not a 4-lane bridge, and you keep it in the same place and the same size, then the permitting process should be expedited. Mr. President, let me spend a few minutes on why this is so important for our economy and for the safety of our citizens. I think most people in this body know our bridges are in poor condition. About 1 in 10 of America's roughly 670,000 bridges are termed and classified as structurally deficient. Let me repeat that in a different way. In the United States, there are more than 61,000 bridges in need of repair. 61,000 bridges. The average age of our bridges, 42 years old. Americans cross these structurally deficient bridges 215 million times a day. Here's where they are. If you look here, leave that. This classifies different bridges. The red category is the most, over 25% of bridges in that part of the country are structurally deficient. The lighter red, 20 to 25%, 15 to 20%. But as you can see, Mr. President, this impacts every state where we have structurally deficient bridges where Americans are crossing 215 million times a day. And let me be clear, it's not just about the economy, where truckers and commerce are crossing these bridges every day. It's about safety. Children and school buses, kids, parents coming home from work. Every state in the union is impacted by this. Let me just give a few quick examples of some of the structurally deficient bridges across the country. This is the Magnolia Bridge, Seattle, Washington, built in 1929. This bridge carries over 18,000 cars per day and has been declared structurally deficient. The Greenfield Bridge in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has the most structurally deficient bridges in the country, and this is one of them. Built in 1921, it carries almost 8,000 cars per day. In 2003, a 10-inch chunk of concrete went through a car windshield, injuring the driver. This structurally deficient bridge has been crumbling for decades. One more, Mr. President, which you will find of significant interest. The Russell Street Bridge, Missoula, Montana. Transportation for America rated the deck of the Russell Street Bridge a 4 out of 10 in terms of structural soundness. It was built in 1957 and carries over 22,000 cars a day. So I think we would all agree that we need to fix these 61,000 structurally deficient bridges. There's no doubt about that. I don't think there's any member of this body or in the federal government that would disagree with that. But what happens when we try to do that? In effect, Mr. President, the efforts, especially of the local communities, are strangled by bureaucratic red tape. Mr. President, the Wall Street Journal recently had an article called "The Highway to Bureaucratic Hell." And what it talked about was this very issue. When communities try to fix their bridges, their structurally deficient bridges, what happens? They gave a number of examples, but I wanted to read one that impacts Americans in the New Jersey, New York area of the country. The Wall Street Journal article stated, another illustration of what happens is the Bayonne Bridge that connects New Jersey to Staten Island, and at 150 feet tall, blocks large cargo ships. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey plans to raise the bridge, a height from 150 feet to 215 feet. They wanted to do that to allow cargo ships going there, same size bridge, they would just raise it instead of having to spend over $3 billion building a tunnel. The article goes on to say, as a reward for that rationality, it took 6 months to identify the lead agency for an environmental review that dragged on for more than 5 years and spanned 20,000 pages. Mr. President, that's not good for New Jersey, that's not good for New York, that's not good for America. So again, what my amendment would do would fix this. Very narrowly tailored, and it would simply make sure that when we are trying to do this, when we are trying to fix the 61,000 structurally deficient bridges in the United States, we can do it in an expedited manner. Not the way in which this Wall Street Journal article described 5 years, 20,000 pages. This amendment is a win-win-win. It'll help spur economic growth. It'll help us with safety of our citizens. It'll help our workers get back to work, to repair and do maintenance and reconstruction on these bridges. And you know, Mr. President, everybody here talks about regulatory reform and how we need it. Even the President in his State of the Union talked about the need to cut red tape to grow this economy. But we rarely act on it. Talk about it, but we don't act on it. So I want to encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, my colleagues particularly from older states, where this amendment will help them more than the rest of the country, and to vote on this amendment, which will keep our families and kids safe, help grow our economy, put workers back to work, and it's a common sense thing to do for our country. I yield the floor.